Today, we're going to check out the specs to the soon-to-be-released Nikon Z8 in comparison to the Sony a7RV and the Canon EOS R5. Let's get to it. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much once again joining me for tea time. Today we have a little bit of misty morning and focus combination, that zing, the bergamot. Just love it. Just love it. I hope you're joining me with your cup of tea, maybe a cup of coffee, hanging out, talking tech, talking photo, talking video. Today is a photo video day. We're going to be talking about the new Nikon Z8 and comparing it to a couple of other cameras that are similar, let's say. So I like to do these comparisons because it shows you the specs between camera to camera to camera to hopefully give you more of an understanding of what they offer and what they don't offer and which one is better for you. These are expensive cameras, all right? So to start out with, they're all well over $3,000. So if you're looking for something cheaper, this video is probably not for you. These are more professional grade cameras that are expensive, but they're close to what we would call flagship cameras. Extremely good full frame mirrorless cameras. Some of them are mirrorless only and some of them are mirrorless and mechanical. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Anyways, before we get into this, I want to say that if you haven't downloaded any of my ebooks, go check them out. Go to the JCristina.com/books. They're 100% free. Also, if you enjoy the content, throw the video a thumbs up. That would be very helpful. Don't forget to subscribe if you're not already and click the little icon right here, that little bell. So when I go live or a new video comes out, you will be notified of it immediately. Also, don't forget our 3,000 push-up challenge that we're currently doing, benefiting the St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. So on all of my videos in May, you'll have a little button that you can click on to donate. All proceeds go directly to the Children's Hospital. So check that out. And finally, I know you've been asking me about what I'm using currently for live streaming and just simply getting a VPN, faster internet, as well as better reliability. And I'm currently using Speedify. If you want to check out Speedify, they have like a summer deal going on. I think it's like 70% off or something crazy. You can get 20% off just from using my code. The code is JCristina. So when you go to speedify.com, use code JCristina, you'll get an additional 20% off. Or you can click the link down below, jcristina.com/speed, and it will automatically apply a 20% discount for you. So let's jump right into this. This is fun for me. I like going through some of these specs. I know specs sometimes can be boring, but it gives us focus, like I said before, on what these cameras can do and what they can't do. And right now, what we understand is the Z8 is described as like a hybrid between a Z7 and a Z9, something in between that. Now, it's also understood that the form factor is going to be very close to a Z6 and a Z7, somewhere right around there. That's the form factor, but the height and the width bigger is going to be more like a D850. Now, you know, I absolutely love the D850. I think the D850 is probably the best DSLR camera ever produced. And I'm a Canon shooter, but it is really that good. So let's get into some of these specs. We're going to start out Nikon Z8, then the Sony a7RV, and then finally the Canon EOS R5 to look at what these cameras are offering. Now, the Nikon Z8 does have a 45 megapixel sensor, just like the Canon EOS R, whereas the Sony a7RV has a 61 megapixel sensor, just definitely bigger. You're looking at an additional, let's call it close to 20 megapixels better on the Sony side, if you're looking for those pixels. Now, remember, we're still talking about a full frame sensor. The difference is how big those pixels are. right? How many can they push or crush into that sensor? Now, when it comes to the minimum and maximum ISO, which I don't really take too much credence to, but what they state is the Z8 is going to have a low of 64 ISO all the way up to 25,600. We see the Sony a7RV coming in at 100 ISO up to 32,000. And then finally, the EOS R is 100 to 51,200. So just listening to that, you're like, oh yeah, 51,000, that's going to be better sensitivity on the Canon EOS R5. That's not necessarily the case. Like I said, don't go by these numbers. We will really be able to compare them apples to apples once that Z8 is shot, and we can take a look and pixel peep of what the low light capability looks like and what the SNR is, or the signal to noise ratio is. So hang tight with that. Now the images, they both shoot RAW, obviously, and different variances of RAW as well as JPEG, so on and so forth. And of course, all three of them will shoot 10-bit. Now, as far as the autofocus points, now this is where things vary a little bit. The Nikon does a 90% by 90% coverage, and it has 493 points of AF, or autofocus, whereas the Sony is at 693 points, and it's covering 100% by 74%. So it's a little bit different on where it is actually covering that sensor, whereas the Canon has 5,940 points of coverage, and it is 90% by 100%. So how that kind of works out when it comes to actually pulling in the autofocus and tracking things, once again, we'll have to see it in the real world, in the field, to see which ends up being quicker. Now, as far as AF detection, this is going to tell us how does it detect autofocus in low light or bright light. So the AF for the Nikon Z8 is -7 stops up to 19 stops, whereas the Sony is -4.5 stops up to 20 stops, and finally the Canon is coming in at -6 stops up to 20 stops. So what we can see here is both the Nikon Z8 and the Canon EOS R5 are very comparable, within a stop of light, whereas the Sony is not as sensitive. Once again, in the field is different than numbers. Okay, so bear that in mind. Now, as far as subject tracking, this has been the case right across the board with all high-end cameras. They all do face tracking and eye tracking and animal tracking and UFO tracking and alien tracking and all the rest of the stuff, right? They track everything. And if they didn't, I would say, well, something is wrong here, but they do. Now, as far as shooting goes, we're seeing 20 frames per second on the Nikon Z8, 10 frames per second on the Sony a7RV, and finally 20 frames per second also on the EOS R5. Bear in mind that is electronic shutter speeds, whereas if we went to mechanical shutter on the Canon EOS R5, for example, you're going to get a maximum of 12 frames per second. Now, there is a difference between the three cameras, between electronic and mechanical shutter, but I'll get into that in just a second. Now, when it comes to VR, or as I call it, in-body image stabilization, or IBIS, we're looking at 5 axis worth of in-body image stabilization. Now, the difference is how many stops of compensation are you getting? The Nikon Z8 is providing 6 stops of image stabilization, whereas the Sony and the Canon are providing 8 stops. So the Nikon's going to be a little bit worse, let's say, when it comes to in-body image stabilization in comparison to the Sony and the Canon. Once again, yet to be seen in the field. Now, as far as capacity or battery capacity, we're seeing 275 shots on that Nikon Z8, whereas the Sony will go all the way up to 530 shots, which is crazy, and the Canon EOS R5 only gets 220 shots. So you can see the difference in the battery. That Sony battery is just the bomb. All right, and it's doing a really good job with handling power. Now, shutter speeds. This is kind of odd. We see a maximum shutter speed on the Z8 of 1/32,000, whereas the other two cameras are getting 1/8,000. Now, 1/4,000 or 1/8,000 is the norm that we see in cameras, but seeing this at 1/32,000 is crazy. You're going to really be able to freeze motion with that type of speed. Now, going back to frames per second and the difference between the three cameras, between mechanical and electronic shutter, so on and so forth. Well, what we found out was the Nikon Z8 does not have a mechanical shutter at all. It is 100% mirrorless, whereas the Sony a7RV and the Canon EOS R5 are both mechanical and electronic shutter. So this is very interesting because Nikon decided to just get rid of the shutter altogether. No more flippy flip in there. But some professional photographers photographers like myself still use a mechanical shutter for certain circumstances. Now, I'm not going to get into that in this video, but that could be a major downfall of the Z8 for certain photographers. So bear that in mind. There is no mechanical shutter, only electronic with the Nikon Z8. Now, as far as the video capturing, they all three do 8K video. The difference is the Nikon Z8 gives you a little bit more frames per second than the other two. For example, the Nikon Z8 will provide 60 frames, up to 60 frames per second at 8K. Now, that is NRAW only, but still, it will get up to 60 frames per second, whereas with the Sony, for example, it will only hit 25 frames per second, whereas the Canon will do 30 frames per second. Now, with 4K, there's a little bit of equality here between the Canon and the Nikon Z8. They're both able to do 4K at 120 frames per second, whereas the Sony cannot. The Sony can do a maximum of 60 frames per second at 4K. So if you need that extra speed or that slow-mo, well, Sony's probably not going to be where you want to go when it comes to video. Now, the LCD panels on the back of these, those flippy screens, or those fully articulating panels, or as they call them, vari-angle panels, whatever you want to call them, those flippy screens on the back, they're all three of them at 3.2 inches. So they're identical. And what's very interesting is these panels are identical also when it comes to dots. What is the resolution? They're at 2.1 megapixels on every single camera. So I don't know, maybe they got like a 3.4 or something and they all bought them from the same place. I don't know, but they are identical. Once again, 3.2 inches and they're sitting at 2.1 megapixels of resolution. Now, the next thing is the EVF. The EVF is that electronic viewfinder, what you're looking through. Now, on the Nikon Z8, the EVF is sitting at 3.6 megapixels, whereas the Sony is at 9.4 megapixels and the Canon is at 5.7 megapixels. So you can see the Sony has a better EVF, or a higher resolution EVF in comparison to the other two. And the worst of the batch, obviously, is the Nikon Z8, with Canon coming in second. Now, besides resolution, the most important thing, in my personal opinion, is the refresh rate. How many hertz does this run at, this EVF? Or how many frames per second does the EVF run at? The reason being is your brain, your eye, can detect a flickering at low hertz. So if you look at a monitor that's sitting at like 20 hertz or 30 hertz in comparison to a monitor that's at 240 hertz, your eye will be able to detect that slight flicker with the 40 hertz in comparison to the 240 hertz. And what that does is it produces fatigue by seeing that flickering. It's just simply not good. And what we find here is with the Z8, it's coming in at 120 frames per second, and the Sony is also at about 100 to 120 frames per second, as well as the Canon. So they're all really, really good when it comes to EVFs. The only difference between the EVFs is the resolution. Once again, the Sony is the one that takes the cake on that, and then comes Canon, and finally the Z8 in last. Now, as far as memory goes, the memory cards are all CF Express, which is great. But what I find interesting is both the Nikon Z8 as well as the EOS R5 both use CF Express Type B, whereas Sony still uses the Type A cards. Now, some of you guys that are not using these cameras for photo and are only using them for video capture are going to want to know what the HDMI out is on these cameras. Now, the Nikon Z8 will give you 10-bit out, where the Sony gives you all the way up to 16-bit out. That is amazing. And then finally, the Canon EOS R5 does 10-bit or even 12-bit, depends on the capture. So we're seeing a big difference between that HDMI port out. So if you're looking at capturing external video, well, that Sony is looking really good at 4K at 16-bit out. That's amazing. Now, when it comes to the weight, the Canon as well as the Sony come in at just over 700 grams, whereas the Nikon Z8 is all the way up to 900 plus grams. So you're looking at 200 grams heavier on that Nikon body. Lastly is the price. The Canon EOS R5 comes in at about $3,400, whereas the Sony a7RV is at about $3,900, both in that 3,000 plus range, just under $4,000. Whereas the Nikon Z8, according to the rumor mill, is going to be coming in right around $5,000 for just the body. Whereas if you want the kit is going to have, I believe, a 24mm millimeter to 120 millimeter lens, and that will be closer to $6,000. This is US money. So the date that we're seeing here is let's call it an announcement date of the 10th of May. So figure on a week away. But the actual release date, or when you'll be able to order or pre-order, or when it will be available, according to what we're hearing, will be May 25th. So this is very exciting. So if you are a Nikon shooter, this camera looks to be exceptional. It's sitting right in that range between a Z9, right? Because if they're saying it's going to come in at $5,000 just for the body, the Z9 is $5,500. So I think you need to weigh the Z8 to the Z9 of both those capabilities. And maybe I'll do a video to actually do that comparison to see which one is right for you, because the prices are so close. And then once you throw a lens on that, they're literally comparable between the Z8 and the Z9. So let me know what you think. If you're a Nikon shooter, are you excited about this? If you're not a Nikon shooter, are you glad that we're seeing finally some photo news that is worthy of speaking about? We know in the last couple of years, the photo industry has been down in the mouth. When it comes to any of the events, any of the shows, the conferences, a lot of them are being canceled. A lot of the publications have went out of business, so on and so forth. It has just been sad times. I hope things start turning around. And when we see new cameras come out, new innovation, that is exciting, and that excites all of the photographers out there, like you and I. Right? So anyways, once again, down below in the comment area, let's have a discussion. Let me know what you think about that Nikon Z8. Is it something that you are willing to spend on, or are you looking more at a Z9, or maybe not Nikon at all and you're looking for a Sony or possibly the Canon? Let me know down below. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for being here. We really do appreciate it. Don't forget to throw the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, click this button, do all of those things. And finally, head over to my website, JCristina.com, where you can find all the photography tools that I've invented for you and me over the years, and hopefully there's something there that you might like. And if there is, please pick it up and support me and my family. That's it, guys. I'm out of here for another vlog. Many blessings to you and your family. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you in the next one. Love you all.